Across the northern plains of North America, distance has a quiet authority. The land stretches outward, without interruption grass, dry wind, scattered ridges of earth, and the long courses of rivers cutting through soil that has changed little over centuries. In places like this, survival can depend on movement alone. And once, in the summer of 1823, a badly injured man began moving across this landscape in a way few people ever had before. The region lay along the upper basin of the Missouri River, where rolling prairie extended across what is now South Dakota. In the early 19th century, the area remained largely unsettled by European Americans. Trails were faint or temporary. Travel moved slowly along waterways and across open grasslands, where visibility could stretch for miles. During summer, the prairie carried a steady wind. Tall grasses bent in long waves. Cottonwood trees gathered near riverbanks where the soil held moisture. Away from those narrow strips of shade, the ground opened into wide fields of dry earth and low vegetation. To the north and west, smaller rivers branched toward the Missouri, including the Grand River, cutting through the plains before joining the larger current. In 1823, this country stood at the edge of expanding trade routes. Trappers, traders, and small expeditions passed through in search of fur-bearing animals that were increasingly valuable in distant markets. Most who entered the plains traveled carefully and in groups. The environment allowed little room for error. Yet somewhere in this vast region, one man would soon find himself completely alone. In the early 19th century, the interior of North America was shaped by a single industry, the fur trade. Beaver pelts, in particular, had become valuable commodities in Europe and the eastern United States, where felt hats remained fashionable and durable. To supply this demand, trapping expeditions moved deep into the western territories, often months away from permanent settlements. By the 1820s, the trade followed the waterways of the continent. Rivers served as the only reliable routes for moving people and supplies through unfamiliar terrain. Among these waterways, the Missouri River formed one of the principal corridors into the northern plains and the Rocky Mountain frontier. Trading companies organized expeditions that traveled upriver in boats, then dispersed into smaller trapping parties once they reached remote regions. The trappers set lines along streams and tributaries where beaver populations remained stable. Each season required long travel, careful planning, and an ability to survive in environments where assistance might be hundreds of miles away. One of the most ambitious enterprises in this trade was organized by William Henry Ashley, a businessman from Missouri, who established a large-scale operation designed to reach farther west than earlier companies had attempted. In 1823, Ashley launched an expedition of trappers and frontiersmen who traveled up the Missouri in keelboats. Their destination was the upper river country, including areas near the Grand River, where wildlife remained abundant. The men who joined these expeditions were rarely ordinary laborers. Most were experienced outdoorsmen, hunters, scouts, former soldiers, or sailors accustomed to hardship. The work demanded endurance and independence. Once the trapping season began, individuals often operated alone or in pairs across wide distances of prairie and forest. Communication with the outside world was minimal. If an accident occurred far from the main party, assistance might never arrive. For those who traveled this frontier, isolation was not unusual. But survival still depended on one simple condition: the ability to keep moving. Among the men who joined the 1823 expedition was Hugh Glass. By the time he traveled up the Missouri River, Glass was already familiar with long periods of hardship in remote environments. Historical records about his early life are limited. Most accounts suggest he was born around 1783 inches, Pennsylvania. As a young man, he reportedly worked as a sailor and spent time traveling along the Gulf Coast. At some point during these years, he was captured by pirates operating in the region. Later narratives describe his escape and eventual return to the American frontier, although the exact details remain uncertain. What is more clearly documented is that Glass eventually moved into the fur trade. Like many frontiersmen of the period, He learned to navigate wilderness terrain and to live off the land for extended periods. Several sources indicate that he spent time living among Native American communities, where he gained experience in hunting techniques and survival practices suited to the plains and river valleys. These skills made him a useful member of trapping expeditions. Men like Glass were valued not only for their ability to hunt animals, but also for their knowledge of geography and seasonal patterns. Rivers, grasslands, and forest edges each required different methods of travel and survival. In 1823, Glass joined the expedition organized by William Henry Ashley. Ashley's group included dozens of trappers and boatmen moving upriver toward the northern plains. Their plan was to establish trapping grounds in regions where beaver populations remained strong. The journey carried them deep into territory that had few permanent settlements. Once the expedition separated into smaller groups, each trapper would operate largely on his own. For experienced frontiersmen, this arrangement was routine. Isolation was expected. But even the most skilled wilderness traveler could not control every event that might occur in the open country. In August of 1823, the trapping party moved through open country near the Grand River, a tributary that flows eastward across the plains before joining the Missouri River. The region supported a wide range of wildlife. Among the animals that occupied the river valleys and surrounding prairie were grizzly bears. At some point during the expedition's movement through this area, Hugh Glass encountered one of these animals unexpectedly. Historical accounts describe a sudden attack by a female grizzly bear, likely defending nearby cubs. The animal struck Glass with considerable force before he had time to retreat. Other members of the expedition heard the disturbance and moved toward the location, but the attack had already caused severe injuries. Reports from the time describe deep wounds across his back and torso. His scalp was torn, and his ribs were exposed in several places. One of his legs was broken during the struggle. By the time the bear was driven away and the other trappers reached him, Glass was barely conscious. The expedition faced a difficult decision. The group needed to continue traveling along the river system, but Glass could not move under his own power. Carrying him across long distances through rough terrain would have slowed the entire party and exposed them to additional risks. Eventually, the leader of the expedition, William Henry Ashley, arranged for two men to remain behind. Their assignment was simple in principle. They would stay with Glass until he died, then bury him and return to the main group. The men waited with the injured trapper for several days. During this time, Glass showed little sign of recovery. His wounds were extensive, and infection was likely already beginning. At some point, the two men made a different decision. Believing that death was inevitable, they left the site. According to later reports, they took Glass's rifle and equipment before departing. When they rejoined the expedition, they reported that the injured trapper had died, but he had not. Sometime later, alone on the prairie, Hugh Glass regained consciousness. When Hugh Glass regained consciousness, he was alone. The prairie around him stretched flat and unbroken, interrupted only by distant rises, scattered trees near the Grand River, and the faint glimmer of the Missouri River, far to the southeast. His body bore severe injuries, a broken leg, deep lacerations across his back and side, and significant tissue damage from the bear attack. Any movement caused pain, yet remaining in place meant certain death. Glass spent several hours, perhaps more, simply assessing his condition. The historical record does not provide his thoughts, only the facts. He did not remain where he had been left. Instead, he made a decision to move, however limited his ability might be. Survival required gradual, deliberate progress. The first challenge was the terrain itself. The tall grasses and uneven prairie floor made crawling difficult, but they also offered minimal concealment from the sun and exposure to the elements. Streams of water were few, but their presence could guide direction. Food sources were limited. Historical accounts indicate that Glass relied on what he could find in his immediate surroundings, including roots, small edible plants, and eventually the meat of animals he could reach. He began moving in the general direction of the Missouri River, estimated to be roughly 80 to 100 miles from his location. The journey was not a straight line. Rivers, ravines, and patches of dense brush required adjustments. The broken leg prevented walking. He had no tools to assist him, no pack to carry supplies. Only the barest implements that remained, perhaps a knife, if it had not been taken by those who abandoned him, provided any support. His movement was slow. Accounts describe him dragging himself with his hands, arms, and uninjured leg, occasionally rolling to avoid obstacles. He created rudimentary paths through the grass, leaving traces behind that no one would follow. Water and occasional shade became critical to survival. Glass adapted to the rhythm of the land, moving in periods when the sun was lower to reduce exposure, pausing under trees and along creek beds when necessary. This deliberate, calculated motion became his lifeline. Every inch gained required careful management of energy, pain, and timing. The human body, severely compromised, needed a reason to continue. The destination, a known trading post along the Missouri, offered the only tangible possibility of survival. The landscape stretched without interruption. Tall grasses shifted in the wind. Small ridges and hollows interrupted the line of sight, and distant river bends marked the only reliable reference points. Hugh Glass moved across this terrain by dragging himself with his arms and uninjured leg, the broken limb trailing behind. Each motion required the full attention of his limited strength. A single misstep could reopen wounds or collapse weakened tissue. Progress was measured in inches, sometimes feet, rather than miles. Grass and brush scraped open cuts, but offered minimal shelter from the sun. Water was scarce. Streams and small pools, when found, were utilized quickly and with care. Without clean drinking sources, the risk of dehydration was constant. Glass reportedly learned to recognize subtle signs in the environment: a damp depression in the grass, a cluster of insects, the slope of the land that indicated the presence of water nearby. Food was limited to what he could reach without standing. Historical accounts note that he used roots and edible plants where possible, and when carrion appeared, he made use of it, consuming small portions to maintain strength. Hunting or trapping animals was impossible given his injuries. His progress depended entirely on conserving energy and making the environment yield whatever sustenance it could. Movement required strategy. Rolling around obstacles, resting under occasional shade, and pausing during the heat of the day became part of a slow, repetitive rhythm. His awareness of terrain features increased with each crawl. He began to recognize patterns, such as wind directions, landmarks, and the distant tree lines that hinted at water sources or shelter. The vastness of the plains offered little in the way of protection from predators. Glass remained alert to the presence of bears, wolves, or other animals that might threaten him, though his physical state left him defenseless. Survival required avoidance, not confrontation. Despite the severity of his injuries, forward motion never ceased entirely. Each inch brought him closer to the Missouri River and the trading post at Fort Kiowa, the only known point where aid could be obtained. In this slow, deliberate movement, the frontier itself became both obstacle and guide, shaping every choice he made as he crawled across the prairie. In the weeks following the attack, survival depended on small, repeated decisions rather than dramatic feats. Hugh Glass relied on the limited resources of the northern plains to sustain himself. Streams, ponds, and intermittent river channels became critical lifelines. Whenever he reached a source of water, he drank sparingly to avoid exhaustion, balancing hydration against the energy required to reach the next source. Shelter was minimal. The prairie offered few natural structures. Glass used depressions in the earth, dense thickets, and fallen logs to shield himself from the sun during midday heat or from cold nights. Shade became a measure of survival as much as water or food. He timed his movements to reduce exposure to the elements, moving during cooler hours and resting when temperatures peaked. Each pause allowed his body to recover enough to continue crawling. His injuries complicated even basic survival. Open wounds attracted insects and risked infection. Bandaging was improvised with strips of clothing, or whatever plant material could be found, pressed against the skin to slow bleeding. Pain was constant, but managing it required only the discipline to move, to drink, and to rest, according to a careful rhythm. Mental endurance became a parallel task. Days merged together. He measured progress by landmarks rather than by the sun or time. Survival demanded patience, observation, and persistence. Each small success, reaching water, finding edible roots, avoiding injury, reinforced the next movement. There was no external reward, only the continuation of life itself. Occasionally, he encountered animal remains, which supplemented nutrition. Small carcasses, fish in shallow streams, or edible plants offered brief reprieves. Glass consumed what he could, often raw, balancing caloric intake against the effort required to acquire it. Through these routines, a system emerged. Each day followed a slow, deliberate pattern: move, rest, hydrate, consume what could be safely eaten, and continue. This methodical approach, honed by frontier experience and knowledge gained from Native American guides, provided the only framework for enduring the prairie in a state of extreme injury. In this way, survival became less about heroic effort and more about the quiet, disciplined application of practical skills over time. As days passed, the concept of time became indistinct. Hugh Glass measured life not in hours or dates, but in landmarks, the movement of clouds, and the subtle changes of the prairie. Each day blurred into the next: crawl, rest, drink, consume, crawl again. Sun and wind dictated routine more than clocks or human schedules. Fatigue accumulated steadily. Wounds, already severe, became inflamed. The broken leg limited leverage and increased pain with every movement. Infection threatened, though historical accounts do not detail its precise progression. Glass's body endured repeated minor setbacks: scrapes, bruises, sunburn, and the constant strain of dragging himself through uneven terrain. Food remained scarce. Roots, edible plants, and the occasional carrion provided minimal sustenance. The nutritional intake was barely enough to maintain movement, yet it was sufficient to prevent immediate collapse. Each discovery became a tactical decision: to eat now or conserve energy to move further. Hydration dictated direction, guiding him towards streams or ponds whenever they could be found. Sleep was fragmented. With no shelter beyond what the landscape offered, brief periods of rest alternated with vigilance against predators and exposure. Night brought relative cool, but introduced the risk of nocturnal animals. Rest became a necessity for the body to sustain forward progress. Despite these constraints, forward motion never ceased. The Missouri River and Fort Kiowa remained distant but known targets. Each day reinforced a simple principle: survival depended on movement, careful observation, and adherence to the small routines that had emerged out of necessity. Time was measured only by inches gained, and the slow contraction of the distance between the injured trapper and the possibility of assistance. By the fourth day, the limits of human endurance had become tangible. Hugh Glass was profoundly weakened. His wounds had worsened, some festering, some raw from constant friction against the ground. The broken leg, unhealed and unsupported, caused intermittent shocks of pain with every motion. Dehydration and malnutrition weighed heavily. Each hour of movement required careful allocation of remaining energy. The environment itself offered no relief. Tall prairie grasses pressed against raw skin, scraping and tearing. Sunlight, unbroken by trees or shade, intensified fatigue. Streams were infrequent, and drinking water often carried silt or microorganisms that could irritate already weakened systems. Shelter was improvised. At best, a hollow under a fallen log, a small depression in the grass, but provided only marginal relief from heat and exposure. Nights brought chill and a constant awareness of the vulnerability inherent in the open landscape. Food was minimal. Accounts indicate that Glass sometimes consumed the flesh of animals he could reach. These included partially decomposed carcasses, which provided necessary calories but carried risk of illness. Roots, berries, and small plants supplemented intake when available. Every morsel had to be weighed against the effort required to obtain it and the risk of further injury. Hunger was omnipresent, yet he maintained forward motion, compelled by the singular goal of reaching the Missouri River. Isolation compounded the physical strain. The days merged into indistinguishable sequences: crawling, resting, drinking, eating, and crawling again. The mind, deprived of contact and stimulation, focused on survival in its most fundamental form. Predators may have passed nearby, though Glass could do little more than avoid them as best he could. Threats were constant, subtle, and inescapable. Despite these challenges, progress continued. He navigated around obstacles, followed faint impressions of game trails, and used distant riverbanks and tree lines to orient himself. Each day, he moved further from the point where the expedition had abandoned him. The slow accumulation of distance offered the only measurable indicator of survival. This stage of survival tested not only the body but the integration of skills, experience, and endurance. Every movement was deliberate. Every rest was strategic. Each decision, whether to crawl toward a patch of shade or toward water, reflected an acute understanding of the environment and its demands. By the end of the fourth day, the combination of exhaustion, pain, and near starvation had brought him to the threshold of survival. Continuation required only the quiet, disciplined application of methods that had sustained him from the moment he regained consciousness. After several days of crawling, Hugh Glass finally reached the banks of the Missouri River. The river was broad, its waters moving steadily toward the southeast, carrying him toward regions with trading posts and occasional settlements. The physical effort required to reach this point had nearly exhausted him, but the presence of the river offered both direction and a chance for survival. At the river, Glass encountered small groups of Native Americans. Records indicate they provided assistance, carrying him to more accessible areas and tending to his wounds to the extent possible. He remained weak and unable to travel independently, but the immediate danger of exposure and dehydration had been removed. Water and food became more accessible, though healing would take weeks, and the risk of infection remained significant. Eventually, he arrived at Fort Kiowa, a station established for the fur trade. There, traders and trappers who recognized him offered shelter, medical aid, and basic care. He had survived the prairie with severe injuries, alone and largely without tools, covering what may have been more than 80 miles through open country. His arrival did not attract celebration. Contemporary records describe only the quiet acknowledgement of his presence, the assessment of injuries, and the provision of sustenance. Survival had been achieved, but at the cost of immense physical strain and near-permanent damage. The journey from the attack site to the river remained one of the most extreme documented cases of human endurance in the American frontier. Every inch moved had been deliberate, and every day had required application of practical survival skills under conditions of profound isolation. The story of Hugh Glass is not one of heroism or legend. It is a record of human endurance under extreme conditions. His survival across the northern plains reflects the practical application of skill, observation, and discipline. The wilderness offered no comfort, no assistance, only the constant demands of the environment and the consequences of injury. Glass's journey underscores the harsh realities of frontier life in the early 19th century. For trappers, isolation and injury were persistent threats, and survival depended on persistence rather than chance. His movement across the prairie, inch by inch, demonstrates how the human body and mind can function under sustained pressure, relying on knowledge and careful decision-making. When he arrived at Fort Kiowa, the prairie returned to silence. The rivers continued their course, the grasses shifted in the wind, and the land remained indifferent to the passage of one man across its expanse. The endurance of Hugh Glass is a quiet testament, measured, deliberate, and contained within the realities of survival, leaving the observer with only the vast, unbroken plains and the persistence required to traverse them.